One of the most underrated sci-fi horror movies of all time, at least when it comes to Bruce Campbell movies, is the horror sci-fi film Moontrap, 1989. That's Bruce Campbell of Evil Dead and Army of Darkness fame, in case you didn't know. You know, classic horror comedy movies, some really good stop-motion animation horror, just cheesy and campy movies with scary stuff. Bruce Campbell partners with Walter Koenig from Star Trek to take out Cyborg's 80s monster movie style in Moontrap. This indie horror movie was filmed in 2 empty warehouse locations and 1 power plant using $3.6 million raised from local Detroit businesses, so that's as independent horror as it gets. The writer and the producer were both friends with Bruce Campbell, and the director had worked with Campbell before as a special effects artist in 1987's Evil Dead 2, so everyone knew each other during the making of Moontrap in 1989. There's sci-fi horror movie scenes with like Predator-style vision and extraterrestrial eggs like aliens, and sometimes the horror movie villains are like RoboCop. Decades later, these horror movie scenes are references to weird stuff that's fallen back in style, so it's fun to watch, and the reactions of Bruce Campbell are funny as ever. Even though there's less horror comedy compared to other Bruce Campbell movies in Moontrap, he's more of just like a sidekick. But he gets plenty of screen time and it's hilarious. This film tries to be scary. The serious tone just makes it really funny. It's so obvious they're walking on Earth, and look at these miniature dolls in this Moontrap scene. It's just so hilarious. And all that's fun to make fun of, but then Moontrap also looks incredibly cool sometimes with like the paintings they use as backgrounds. I looked up who painted this, and they did some background art for Evil Dead 2. So these other scenes look really cool. Everything was done with miniature creature feature models filmed up close, you know, low budget movie style. And some of the special effects artists from Moontrap worked on horror movies like Return of the Living Dead 3, Phantasm 5, and the first Silent Hill. More than one of them worked on Mosquito, starring Gunnar Hansen, who's Leatherface from the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Plus, this cheesy sci-fi horror movie music is campy as can be. Same person who like wrote the music for horror movies like Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness, and then later on like Cult of Chucky, and on Netflix, Ash vs. Evil Dead and Chucky episodes. So the music in Moontrap sounds really cool. I like it. They wanted to make a sequel to Moontrap in the 90s, but Moontrap 2 never officially happened. This is kind of an embarrassing moment in the history of this horror movie, but the writer and the director tried to make a Kickstarter in 2011 for Moontrap 2, and they got $50. Like, this is such an underrated horror movie series that not even Bruce Campbell fans remember it. But the same writer and director got together again in 2017 to make Moontrap Target Earth. It's a standalone plot, so not a true horror movie sequel like Moontrap 2 was supposed to be. But for fans of Bruce Campbell movies and 80s horror sci-fi and on low budget in general, with weird style and a lot of campiness, Moontrap was underrated and definitely worth a watch. Kind of a rare horror movie though, so you might have to get a physical copy.
Why don't you put on that Godzilla movie till I get back?
Alright.
Brain Twisters is a campy 90s sci-fi horror movie loaded with virtual reality horror, mind control, and the biggest and most bountiful super mullet I have ever witnessed. Look at that absolute masterpiece of a hairstyle. 4 stars. What, do you have to water that thing? This psychological chiller thriller movie was filmed around Scranton, Pennsylvania, same as The Office, and the main character is a total sleazebag who looks a lot like the boss from Office Space.
You take a few days off.
There are like so many classic bad horror movie moments and memorable horror movie quotes in this film because of him alone. Almost every scene he's in is just unintentionally hilarious horror comedy. And underrated, I guess. If you like Mystery Science Theater 3000 type of horror movie quality material.
I want to apologize for throwing that macaroni.
The company that released Brain Twisters is called Crown International Pictures, and they're this indie horror label responsible for quirky old movies like Dracula's Dog and Bloodlust, the black and white horror movie classic, and My Mom's a Werewolf. And I'm so glad they put this horror sci-fi movie out because it's a very low budget slasher movie that tries its best to be like Cronenberg movies with the corporate espionage of Videodrome and mind control of scanners, and it's got some crime horror with the lead detective, trail of terror, blah blah, the 90s, blah blah. It falls way short of any Cronenberg movie, but the campy early 90s horror is in full force. This isn't a trauma film, but it might as well be. It has the special effects and camera crew from The Toxic Avenger 2 and 3, and that trauma film War, and Class of Nukem High. They're all early classic trauma films, so if this movie looks a little familiar, that's why. One of the special effects artists eventually worked on Highlander Endgame, and the cameraman worked on the Godzilla 2014 monster movie. So at least there's some talent behind the scenes, driving this underrated horror sci-fi movie. And I only say it's underrated because it's so funny. Like, if you have a weird sense of humor and you like cheesy and campy 80s and 90s horror movies as much as I do, and especially if socially awkward scenes just make you laugh, then this is definitely an underrated horror comedy film that'll keep you entertained for a while. The director of Brain Twisters, Jerry Sangiuliano, I found out passed away in 2018 at the age of 73, and he made mostly horror short films. I was only able to find one called Hello Goodbye. It was just this really weird experimental short film with these floating heads talking in a bunch of different languages for 7 minutes straight.
Jumbo.
Hola.
That's some creepy stuff, I guess, or at least weird. Another short film I was only able to find a description for, but it has some psychological horror aspects. And that's pretty much the entire horror history of Brain Twisters 1991. You're welcome. Check it out, streaming for free on Tubi TV, underrated horror sci-fi film.
I'll see you later.
Life Changer is a great low-budget indie horror film with an original plot and excellent atmospheric horror suspense delivered in a postmodern, neo-noir style. This monster movie follows a shapeshifter as they switch from host to host and narrate in first person. Horror legend Lance Hendrickson agreed to narrate this thriller movie until the Screen Actors Guild told him that he couldn't do it because it's a non-union project. Burt Reynolds was considered next for narration until they ultimately got Bill Oberst, who was in the indie horror title All Hallows Eve 2, the horror movie sequel that most notably lacked Art the Clown from Terrifier. Filmed in 20 days in Toronto, this film, Life Changer, mixes a twisted horror romance with one of the best examples of body horror. This creepy stuff looks straight out of a David Cronenberg movie, no joke, and I was not surprised to find that one of the special effects makeup artists went on to do Crimes of the Future 2022 David Cronenberg remake. Some of the special effects team also went on to work for the Wrong Turn remake and John Wick Chapter 4. The indie horror movie scene is just looking better and better, and sometimes a look at this movie reminds me of It Follows with its neo-noir horror of low-angle and high-angle shots. The practical old-school 80s 90s horror movie effects with minimum CGI look absolutely fantastic. As for the writing, I really enjoyed how they make the actors share the same mannerisms as the shapeshifter takes different forms. This movie makes the monster more believable through shared mannerisms like playing with a marble or tapping surfaces or scratching the back of their neck. Most alien invasion movies make the shapeshifter have very little mannerisms and unable to sound human. Taking this in the other direction is an underrated horror sci-fi movie concept that I hope other films explore. Aside from some funding issues, director Justin McConnell, who wrote and edited Life Changer himself, ran into various location problems like angry landlords and bad contracts and other weird things that indie horror movie makers have to put up with. But he did it, and in 2018, Life Changer developed a growing cult classic fan base after debuting across 10 countries in 6 months, and then the horror movie played on Netflix. For the making of Life Changer, Justin McConnell drew inspiration from the movie Enemy, that 2013 horror movie with the actor from Donnie Darko, as well as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Thing, and The Borrower, made by the same director as the underrated horror crime thriller movie Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. The creativity of this script and the special effects more than manages to surpass its low budget. I wouldn't mind seeing what Justin McConnell can do with a bigger budget next time in a horror movie sequel to Life Changer, so definitely check out one of the greatest modern sci-fi classic movies, Life Changer, streaming for free on Tubi. The Puppet Master is an underrated hidden horror movie gem that's one of the best lesser-known Donald Sutherland movies. The action horror sci-fi film has brain slugs jumping around like facehuggers that were designed by Larry Odian from Bram Stoker's Dracula. These animatronic puppets that he made are remote controlled, and he says he had some stingrays in mind, but come on, those are from Alien. Speaking of Alien, Yaphet Kotto has a small role in this film, and acting next to Donald Sutherland is Keith David from John Carpenter's The Thing and They Live, and there's Richard Belzer too. Is it worth mentioning that a scientist role by Will Patton from a really good underrated sci-fi horror film called The Mothman Prophecies is in here too? I guess I just did. The Puppet Masters movie is a lot like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is no doubt why they chose Donald Sutherland for his amazing character in Invasion of the Body Snatchers 1970s remake. Funny story about the Puppet Masters. This film was supposed to be set on an Air Force base, and then the 90s remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers came out in 1993, and it was set on an Air Force base, and they had to rewrite the whole script for the Puppet Masters. And they had to rewrite the script from scratch like a whole bunch of times. The writers had their first draft rejected because it was too much like the Robert Heinlein book, even though that's what they agreed to do. The studio kept giving them all these different rules. They wanted like a end-of-the-world alien invasion movie that didn't have a spaceship, and then they didn't want to have like the president as a character, and then they started fussing about having a female protagonist. It took these poor writers like several years to figure out a script and get things ready. And then they picked out a director who like worked on a lot of Phil Collins videos, and he hated the script and he made them rewrite it like 3 weeks before the making of Puppet Masters. So this was like a real life horror story to get done. You know, now the Puppet Master has become like an underground cult classic horror sci-fi movie, don't get me wrong, but a lot of people hated this movie when it came out because it was nothing like the book. The writers hated this horror movie because it was not based on the book anymore, and the author of the book didn't like it. So all in all, this movie lost $6.5 million on a $15 million budget, and if they had gone with the first script, people probably would have liked it better. But this is an underrated horror sci-fi movie. It's pretty cool. It's like if Invasion of the Body Snatchers movie had more action horror scenes. If you like campy 90s action horror that feels like a longer X-Files episode, then The Puppet Master is a great movie to check out on Amazon Prime. Night of the Creeps is an underrated horror sci-fi movie that combines zombie movies and end-of-the-world alien invasion movies. Director Fred Dekker, who made The Monster Squad and RoboCop 3, was feeling ambitious because this was his first movie and he wanted to include a little bit of everything. Night of the Creeps is a slasher movie, it's a crime mystery thriller, and most of all, it's an underrated 80s horror sci-fi classic. Fred Dekker says he was inspired by Alien and The Blob and a lot of Roger Corman movies. He cast Tom Atkins from Halloween and The Fog, and there's cameos from other famous 80s horror movie stars like Dick Miller from Gremlins and Suzanne Snyder from Return of the Living Dead 2, Robert Kerman from Cannibal Holocaust, and Steve Oliver from House 3, plus the Sandwich Cop is from Chud, or CUHD, however you want to say it. On the special effects side is Ernest Farino from The Terminator, and he did the title sequence for Night of the Creeps to make it look like The Shining with its blue font, and to make it look like the 1950s giant monster movie with mutant ants, Them. Robert New from Prom Night with Jamie Lee Curtis did the camera work, and some of the scenes are directed by Steve Miner, who did Friday the 13th 2 and 3, and Halloween H2O and Lake Placid 1 and House 1, pretty good horror movies. Steve Miner's help with the movie is why the janitor has the last name of Miner. All the last names of the characters in this movie are horror director references, like there's Cynthia Cronenberg, James Carpenter Hooper, and Christopher Romero. And don't forget a character named Officer Raimi, Sam Raimi from the Evil Dead movie. Another cool thing about Night of the Creeps is all the special effects artists are zombies in this film. So you have like David Miller, who I guess could be considered a lead special effects artist because he developed the brain slugs for Night of the Creeps. That's what the creeps are called, the zombie brain slugs. Some of the creeps had motors underneath them, and others were just attached to strings. As for the history of this horror film, since Fred Dekker was really young and this was his first horror movie, he was new and he had some disagreements with the editor over the pace of this film. He wanted more action horror, and they were trying to make it more like slow burn horror. So the shed scene and the lawnmower scene were added in later to give the movie more action. And then he argued a little bit about the poster, which he thought the art looked too much like House 1. So the director, now wonders if these disagreements may have been why the film had a limited release in theaters. Night of the Creeps did poorly with test audiences because they were shown this unfinished version of the movie that didn't have all the special effects yet, but it went on to develop a cult classic following through VHS and DVD releases and being shown on television over the decades. This is definitely an underrated horror movie and one of the best zombie movies you need to watch if you've never seen it. It's classic 1980s horror with a lot of memorable horror movie quotes. And in fact, the making of Night of the Creeps began with a single scene in Fred Dekker's head. He had a character picking up the phone and saying, "Thrill me," and this line is somehow caught on throughout horror movie history. He worked the rest of the script around that horror movie quote, and so began one of the greatest zombie movies of the 80s decade, I guess. I like it. If you like 1980s slasher horror movies with a sci-fi zombie twist, then check out Night of the Creeps, streaming on Amazon Prime. This 80s horror movie, Creepazoids, is one of the more underrated of Linnea Quigley movies. She's best known for Return of the Living Dead in that graveyard scene. Anyway, this is an early film from David DeCoteau, who's the director of Puppet Master 3 and so many other cheesy movies so bad they're good. The next year, he would follow up with the cult classic bad horror movie Sorority Babes in the Slimeball Bowl-O-Rama with Linnea Quigley, and I don't like it. Anyway, I do like Creepazoids because it has a ton of cheesy and campy retro-style scares. There's like green screen computers with live journals and underground bunker vaults and slimy mutants, coincidentally with the body from Alien and the tusk from Predator. Lots of survival horror. I would say this inspired Fallout games, but really it's just a typical end-of-the-world plot for any post-apocalyptic horror movie from the 80s. One of the reasons that nobody remembers Creepazoids is because it had a small theater release. After that, the low-budget creature feature grew into more of like a cult classic horror movie by word of mouth and VHS tapes. Nobody's acting career really grew because of Creepazoids. Richard Hawkins was in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Linnea Quigley movies were already popular, and she was a producer for this one, Creepazoids. That brings me to another reason this post-apocalyptic film is way underrated. Nobody really remembers the stars, but they do remember these 80s horror movie special effects. The various members of the special effects team for Creepazoids went on to do other sci-fi and horror movies such as Maniac Cop, The Abyss, Terminator 2, the Blade movies, and Creepshow 1. The designer of the creature worked on Ghoulies 2 and the Blob 1988 remake, both of which are really good horror movies. Since this production is one of Charles Band's movies, the Creepazoid mutants were originally supposed to be like small puppets like Ghoulies 2. There's a lot of other horror movies everyone worked on that I could mention, but I just wanted to give credit to one particular person by name, Peter Cosillo. He made one of the craziest monsters in Creepazoid. Like, everybody remembers this scene. It's basically what makes this 80s movie so memorable today. And it's actually a reference to another monster movie, a horror comedy movie called It's Alive. So this is the work of Peter Cosillo, and he also sculpted the very next year the Beetlejuice snakehead in 1988. So that's one of the most famous horror movie scenes in 80s horror history. He was just really on a roll back then, I guess, and he never gets credit. Other than that, this has the same director of photography as like Slumber Party Massacre 2, which is this underrated 1987 slasher film that released the same year. And this person also did camera work for like Critters 3 and 4 and Project Metal Beast, which is this cybernetic robot werewolf horror movie from the 90s. And just a lot of other horror movies. Check out Creepazoids from Full Moon Features, as well as Empire Pictures back then, and it's streaming for free on Tubi. Of all the John Carpenter movies, Prince of Darkness is the most underrated. Horror movies like this are rare because the director had all the creative control over the film. John Carpenter movies have been getting changed around since his very first movie, The Eyes of Laura Mars. He was tired of all the scary things getting censored by the studio, so he decided to create his own low-budget horror movie and do what he wants. The making of Prince of Darkness cost $3 million, and it has influences from supernatural movies like The Exorcist, The Shining, The Amityville Horror, and most of all, Dario Argento's Inferno. So John Carpenter is a really big fan of Italian horror movies. You can really see this in the Michael Myers influence from Torso, which is an Italian horror movie from the 70s, the same year, right before Halloween. The Eyes of Laura Mars was supposed to be like a giallo movie until the studio rewrote it. Giallo is just an Italian crime thriller movie, so that's what he wanted Eyes of Laura Mars to be, until the studio completely rewrote it and made it more into an American horror movie, which really made him mad. So John Carpenter really put himself into this film. I mean, literally. The protagonist has his signature mustache, and John Carpenter does a couple of the voiceovers himself in these Prince of Darkness scenes. He combines supernatural end-of-the-world movies with zombie movies and this quantum physics sci-fi horror plot. It's pretty cool. But unfortunately, the underrated horror movie got no attention at the box office because the horror suspense thriller movie Fatal Attraction was in theater at the same time, and nobody can compete with that film. It was the biggest thriller movie in 1987, so it beat everything. Otherwise, more people probably would remember Prince of Darkness. So John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness has become a hidden horror movie gem, and it's full of 80s nostalgia, and it has like a campy, weird, almost like a Ghostbusters in a weird way meets Hellraiser type of feel. There's mullets, which you know I'm a big fan of, and big computers, and like all John Carpenter movies, an awesome synth horror movie soundtrack. It's all right here in Prince of Darkness. Pretty much the only 80s horror movie where Donald Pleasance gets to talk to Victor Wong, or rather Grandpa Moritanaki from the Three Ninjas from the 90s. You remember him? Plus, that's not all. Hard rocker Alice Cooper makes a cameo appearance as a possessed zombie in a few scenes, and Prince of Darkness is just great. It's like the perfect combination of splattery, old school special effects and cheesy 80s horror movie quotes.
This is Kaka!
So John Carpenter used influences from Inferno, and then he has like a 50s horror movie influence. Like much of the movie is long scientific explanations with scenes that could have just been lifted straight from 1950s creature feature films, you know, like Donald Pleasance just discusses the monster in depth and they figure out its weaknesses and then they get their revenge. It's a slow burn horror with like 40 minutes of suspenseful supernatural build-up, something the studio would probably not let him do, but it's cool to see like his real style, unfiltered. So John Carpenter makes a low-budget horror movie that looks great, you know, with Prince of Darkness. There's plenty of creepy stuff to make your skin crawl, and the special effects were done using like low-budget stuff, like they use a swimming pool late at night. Another scene uses liquid mercury drained from heavy equipment on the set for a big evil monster hand to push through and have like a glittery, weird, sparkly effect. Prince of Darkness is a mashup of many different horror genres, probably the only monster movie where the zombies barricade the survivors inside of a building instead of the other way around. And the horror sci-fi movie is campy and cheesy with this very serious apocalyptic plot that's surprisingly deep. The studio no doubt would have simplified all this stuff, but John Carpenter treats the audience like they're intelligent, and it's just an underrated sci-fi horror movie in that respect. If you like zombie movies mixed with end-of-the-world movies and sci-fi horror and classic slasher movie moments, then Prince of Darkness is streaming for rent on Amazon Prime. It's a good horror movie worth watching if you like John Carpenter and Donald Pleasance movies. Sphere is a 1998 film that wanted to rank among the greatest classic horror sci-fi movies ever made, but ended up a box office flop. How does a horror suspense movie starring Dustin Hoffman, Samuel L. Jackson, Sharon Stone, and Queen Latifah versus Jellyfish go wrong? It looks like The Abyss or Cocoon, and those were great sci-fi movies with moments of atmospheric horror, so what's wrong with this one? Director Barry Levinson had been putting out hit films for decades, and the studio trusted him with $80 million to make the most expensive horror sci-fi movie of the 1990s. They filmed this movie in these two giant underwater temperature-controlled tanks with 20 million gallons of water each. And that's where a lot of things went wrong with the Sphere. First of all, the microphones inside of the actors' helmets kept shorting out during the making of Sphere, and so they had to redo scenes constantly. This was one of the first movies to go CGI, so the actors weren't very used to being told to look at nothing. Allergies, believe it or not, were really bad that season in the Napa Valley, so everyone felt like a wreck. But most of all, filming underwater was really confusing and even dangerous. At one point during the making of Sphere, Dustin Hoffman had his suit put on wrong, and he had to claw his way up a ladder because nobody knew he was sinking to the bottom with a helmet full of water. Samuel L. Jackson also had a scare when his air tube stopped working, and even after he gave the emergency signal, they struggled getting his air tube working again, and they had to rush him out of the tank. So the underwater scenes really threw everyone off their game. Sphere tried its best under these difficult filming conditions, but it's ultimately a giant monster movie without much of an underwater monster. Luckily, Samuel L. Jackson has some great memorable horror movie quotes that go mostly forgotten in the history of horror. He shaved his head for this movie because his last movie was an older character, so Sphere brought us the classic Samuel L. Jackson's shaved head look that he still sports today. The Sphere is an underrated movie because it was kind of rushed and they were doing a lot of improv scenes and really just still working their characters out. Even Dustin Hoffman and Samuel L. Jackson both say the ending of The Sphere was not satisfying. If they had more time, it could have been a better movie. But even though this is admittedly a mediocre or even a bad sci-fi horror movie at times, you have to consider how much worse it would have been if they had not used the best Hollywood actors at the time. I mean, this movie could have very well have not gotten finished. At the center of the Sphere, though, is a smart script that requires a second viewing to notice all the creepy things hidden in the background of this movie. The only problem is, nobody's going to watch a 2-hour and 15-minute horror movie that they didn't enjoy once a second time. Alien invasion movies are supposed to be, high energy, but the end of the world slows to a crawl in this movie I think this film was just trying to achieve the atmospheric horror of The Shining and kind of fell short because of time constraints and just a very difficult way of filming underwater. This sci-fi horror movie does have a cult classic following, however, so I say check out Spirit and see if you think this is an underrated horror movie or not. I thought this was a bad horror movie at first, but I've since changed my mind after multiple viewings over the years. Sphere 1998 is streaming on Amazon Prime if you want to take a watch and figure it out, but the first time is probably going to be very confusing.
Dirtball, you got 2 seconds to live.
Before he was Rambo, Sylvester Stallone's very first appearance was in the all-time best of Roger Corman movies, Death Race 2000. This 1975 dystopian sci-fi flick is about some pretty creepy stuff, a big race event that gives points for taking out pedestrians. There's a big reference to this Roger Corman movie in one of the horror movie scenes from The Toxic Avenger by Troma Films. Funny enough, Roger Corman didn't think that Sylvester Stallone would ever be much of a hero protagonist, so he cast him as the villain, and horror movie actress Mary Warrenoff from Night of the Comet and The Devil's Rejects thought the script that Stallone was writing at the time would never go anywhere. He was writing Rocky. One of the reasons this is an underrated horror sci-fi movie, aside from most people simply never hearing of it, is that some people don't think that Death Race 2000 is a horror movie at all. I can see why, but Roger Corman himself said the script calls for more than a few horror movie moments, and he describes the movie as a horror film whenever he's building tension and suspense, so I guess that settles it. This movie is maybe like 95% sci-fi and 5% comedy horror, but it's still horror sci-fi nonetheless, according to Corman. This fisherman, Stan Ross in real life, he's basically the reason this is one of the most brutal and savage movies Corman has ever made. Every time Roger Corman left this person, Stan Ross, in charge of a scene, he would make sure that it became like a horror movie scene and that scary things were caught on camera. When you really start to analyze Death Race 2000, each of the racers can be seen as like a slasher, and each of the cars could be considered a creature. Corman would ride around in this monster vehicle offset, by the way. That's kind of funny, like on his own personal time. Anyway, David Carradine plays a villainous monster named Frankenstein, and everyone's afraid of him, and he has some weird moments that are kind of like Phantom of the Opera with his mask, in a way. There were some stunt drivers for this movie, but all the actors did their own stunts, except for Mary Warrenoff, and she had to get towed for all of her scenes, or else the stunt driver had to drive for her. Corman did a lot of the stunt work himself because the stunt workers didn't want to drive cars that weren't street legal without a permit. Like, can you imagine what would have happened if they got pulled over in one of these cars? These are modified Volkswagens that cost about $5,000 each. They filmed for 17 days driving up and down the freeway and downtown LA without permits, like I said. They weren't really speeding too much for the making of Death Race 2000, they just sped up the footage. Roger Corman learned a lot of car photography tricks from working with the Dracula director Francis Coppola on a 1960s hot rod drama flick. So here's a question. Do you consider Death Race 2000 in the action sci-fi horror movie genre? There's a lot of cheesy, campy horror comedy in my opinion, so I'd say it's a horror movie. It's just an interesting question to ask for fun. So watch Death Race 2000 streaming for free online at Tubi and find out for yourself, because this is definitely, if not a horror movie, one of the classic sci-fi movies on a low budget. The Arrival is a 1996 horror sci-fi cult classic movie written and directed by David Twohy, who wrote G.I. Jane and The Fugitive. Most people know him for Chronicles of Riddick. I remember him best for writing the horror sci-fi movie Critters 2, one of my favorites. The Arrival is a really cool sci-fi movie that follows actor Charlie Sheen as he tries to communicate with these beings from outer space, and it's one of the most underrated alien invasion movies of all time. What's awesome about David Twohy movies is that he is a realistic science fiction writer, meaning there's like real science in the movie The Arrival. What's cool about this horror movie is the sci-fi elements are truly like what David Twohy is interested in. He wanted to become an astronomer before he became a horror movie director. This was his very first film about exploring the strangest discoveries ever found in space, and then They have some horror movie scenes that are a lot like another horror sci-fi classic, Fire in the Sky. But here's the main reason why The Arrival is the most underrated horror movie of all time. You know the horror movie scene with the aliens' knees that bend backwards? The Arrival is the horror movie scene where like the aliens' legs bend backwards at the knee. So many people don't remember the name of this movie, but it's like one of the most famous CGI horror movie scenes in 90s horror movie history. This was absolutely shocking horror for its time. I think this might be one of the first creature feature movies of the 90s to have a CGI movie monster. I know The Relic did it a year later at the beginning of 1997, followed by Mimic. Is this the first? Is The Arrival the first? I guess you could count the CGI creature feature Casper in 1995. Unfortunately, this movie lost $10 million on a $24 million budget, but it has a legitimate excuse. The Arrival opened on the same week as Will Smith and Independence Day, so there were two alien invasion movies that summer, and this one lost really bad. But The Arrival deserves to have more credit. It's definitely one of the greatest and most underrated of the sci-fi classics, in my opinion. And it looks and feels like a Spielberg movie at times. It really is just smart horror sci-fi. And I know this is hard to believe, but Charlie Sheen gets to play someone who loses their mind, and he somehow pulls it off. Somehow. He does a great job. So check out The Arrival, streaming free with other underrated horror movies on Tubi.